Chapter 3, and carbon and the molecules it makes. We will be... You can hear my dog sometimes. First talking about carbon, the bonds it can make, and the shape of the molecules that it can make. Carbon molecules have some distinct shapes because of the way it can bond to other elements. So first let's look at the valence of carbon. So carbon has 6 electrons. They fill according to the rules you learned last year. In a typical Lewis dot structure, we have the first 2 going in the s orbital, and then usually with the Lewis dot diagrams we draw the next 4 spaced out separately like that. So carbon would really like to share electrons with other atoms and make covalent bonds. 3 other elements very important in biological molecules are nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen. Hydrogen will make 1 bond because it has just 1 more electron needing to fill up that s orbital. Oxygen has 6 electrons in the outer orbital with an atomic number of 8, so it would like to share 2 electrons. Nitrogen has 3 available to bond. So all of these guys will make covalent bonds, and sometimes they are polar covalent bonds depending on the electronegativity of the atom. For example, oxygen is very electronegative, as you heard about in the water discussions, holds the electrons very close to it, therefore making a polar covalent bond. So when we start looking at carbon structures, the simplest ones to look at in organic chemistry are just made of carbons and hydrogens, and basically we grow the chain of carbons. Carbon not only likes to make covalent bonds with, for example, hydrogen in this case, but it will also make a nice covalent bond with itself, so it can make a growing chain, and you'll see some more pictures of that next. There's real specific naming in organic chemistry. ANE ending refers to single bonds, and ENE refers to double bonds when they're between the carbons. You'll see that later. What is this important for? Well, it kind of dictates the structure of the molecule. We have here the ball and stick model, which you made models with last year. You'll usually see these structural formulas drawn out here. And then there's the space filling models that give you a little bit more 3-dimensional features. If you add a double bond, like this one here, we took a molecule that had a lot of rotation in this molecule, it can really freely rotate around, to one that's more constrained. And that's going to play a role, and it also makes it very linear because it's very constrained, it has nothing popping up here. That's going to be important when we start looking at the types of molecules that carbon can make. So again, just kind of a super brief overview of organic chemistry. You can classify, or you can look at the different lengths of molecules. The ET stands for 2 carbons. The pro stands for 3 carbons. We can continue growing this. We'll see long hydrocarbon chains. We start talking about lipids and fats with the fatty acid tails. So then once you get to 4 carbons, the Bu prefix means 4 carbons. We could have butane. And then now we could start doing some branching, which is interesting. So another feature to add in on our naming is that once you get, you start naming carbons based on the position in the chain. We start from left to right, so this is carbon number 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if we move one of the bonds of those CH3 groups, or methyl groups, to the second carbon, we now have 2-methyl propane. We now name it after the longest chain, which is propane. We now say that the second carbon, 2, has a methyl group attached to it. Now, I'm never going to ask you to do this in class, but it helps to identify the differences between molecules. These 2 molecules have the same molecular formula. They are C4H10, but if I say C4H10, you don't know what it looks like. And one of the huge ideas in biology I hope you will get by the end of the year is that living organisms use molecular shape to create enzymes, protein structure, and all the functions in a cell. So these 2 are called structural isomers. Structural isomers refer to the same molecular formula but a different arrangement of the bonds. Then you can also have those double bonds we talked about a minute ago. So both of these are butene. The ENE means there's a double bond between 2 carbons somewhere. And 1 butene means that the double bond's on the first carbon. Obviously 2-butene means that it's on the second carbon. So somebody can say this and you can immediately write it down. Now your chains can grow longer. We're not going to put the 5 in here, but once we get to 6 carbons, it is more thermodynamically stable to have those molecules make a ring. So a simple one is cyclohexane. The ANE ending means that there are single bonds. Or you can have benzene. ENE means that there are double and single bonds. This guy here is interesting. I think I should have been zooming through. Excuse me. I will zoom over to benzene to be able to get a closer picture. We'll bring this idea up later on, this idea that you should remember again from chemistry called resonance. And that's the idea that these electrons are not stable. They are not just in one place. Well, they're stable, but they're not just always static. They're actually moving between the carbons, and this single bond can flip with this double bond and vice versa, and they're always kind of moving around. There's actually not a static double or single bond here. It's kind of moving around. And we're going to use this, our molecules will use this property when we talk about photosynthesis. It's one of the ways that light energy gets captured. So we can grow these carbon chains, and they do have different properties based on their length and the position of bonds, but we can really change the chemistry of a molecule by adding functional groups. So we're going to define some functional groups in a minute, and these you are responsible for knowing all of them. So these different functional groups can give molecules some special chemistry. This is the list of 7 functional groups I need you to remember. And we'll go through them one by one. So a carbonyl functional group is going to add some polarity to the molecule. It's a carbon either at the end of a ring or in the middle of an end of a structure or in the middle of a structure, and it has a double bond to oxygen. The name of the group is carbonyl, and it can have 2 different names depending on the location. This molecule or this functional group is called a ketone if this carbonyl is in the middle of a carbon skeleton like this. It's at the second carbon here. And it's called an aldehyde if that carbonyl is at the end. So propanal is an example of a 3-carbon structure with the C double bond O at the end. Notice these have the same molecular formula, but they are totally different molecules depending on the position, so they're isomers. Carbonyls. Next, a sulfhydryl. So this is characterized by a sulfur, and it's an SH. So sulfur wants to make 2 bonds. It'll make 1 to that carbon chain and 1 to a hydrogen. I usually don't ask you to remember the term thiol, but these molecules are referred to as thiols. A sulfhydryl group can be really important in amino acids when we get to them. We'll talk about them later, about making a disulfide bond, which helps to stabilize a protein structure. It has to be made by an enzyme. It's a very permanent covalent bond. So that's a sulfhydryl. SH. A carboxyl, not to be confused with the carbonyl. Fortunately, they sound so much alike. This is an organic acid, a carboxylic acid. It's an acid because you could gain or lose that hydrogen that's on the end. So a carboxyl is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen, and then it has another OH attached to it. We're going to talk about the name of that in a second. But in this case, it is a carboxylic acid. A very simple form is acetic acid. You know this as vinegar at home. So acetic acid has a carboxyl attached to it. This is bonded to the rest of the chain, and it's a C double bond O, OH. Methyl groups we saw a minute ago when we were talking about the chains. Those are the most hydrophobic. They have C to carbon with 3 hydrogens around it, abbreviated like that. We're going to see methyl groups getting added to the C's in DNA, and the whole field of epigenetics, or controlling gene expression, can be modified by adding or removing Ch3 groups. So we're going to see these later on. Again, they're very hydrophobic because although the electronegativity between the carbon and hydrogen is not identical, it is so close. that is essentially hydrophobic. A hydroxyl group is another simple way to change the polarity of a carbon chain. So simply by adding an oxygen, we now have a very polar molecule here. This is going to want to interact with water. Hydroxyls, OHs, when they are added to a molecule, will make a molecule called an alcohol. So an OL will be added to the end. We're going to see a lot of these. Ethanol, the stuff that's in beer and wine and hard liquor and such, is 2 carbons. And instead of this being a hydrogen here, as it is in ethane, it now has an OH, and it changes the properties tremendously. It now likes to form a lot of hydrogen bonds. It's very soluble in water. The amino group is an NH2 group. It's called a molecule that has an amino group on it is called an amine. We will be talking a lot about amino acids very soon. An amino acid is composed of a central carbon, an amine group on one end. We just talked about this. This is the carboxyl group on the other end. Very specific, very special properties. The amine group the amino group can gain and lose the hydrogen here, depending on the pH that it's found in. It can pick up a hydrogen and then have a positive charge. Phosphates, we will see these a lot. Phosphate adds a significant amount of charge to a molecule when you add it in. Not only is it polar because of those oxygens, but it's also can be charged. It's going to be a huge player in the molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, has 3 phosphates on it. It's an important component in DNA. We're going to gain and lose phosphates and activate proteins. We'll see the phosphate molecule coming, functional group coming and going a lot. And just to remind you how important these functional groups are, we will see these molecules pretty soon when we talk about lipids. These are testosterone and estrogen. They are sterols. They have these interesting ring structures, so we know from the previous part of the slides that at each of these angles we have a carbon with hydrogens hanging off it. In the case of testosterone, like we have an extra methyl group right here. This guy's just flip-flopped over. It's extra methyl group. Anyway, depending on whether testosterone or estrogen is there will lead to different physical appearances. We'll talk about that a whole lot later when we talk about the functions of different hormones. But the thing to remember here, and this is kind of funky because they're mirror images right now, here's a double bond to oxygen. Here's a double bond to oxygen. Ring, methyl group, ring, methyl group. So the difference we're talking about is this methyl group, which is hanging off down here somewhere. And lastly, you want to make sure that you can do these things at the end of the section. You want to explain how the structure of a carbon atom leads to emergence of complexity. So basically, what makes those carbon molecules more complex? You need to identify all those functional groups I just went through. They're in your textbook. And you want to explain how each functional group can contribute to properties. So which one makes polar, which one will make it more charged, which one will, in the case of sulfhydryl, allow it to be bonded. And that's it.